my previous video, I discussed how college interviews are almost useless. And in this video, I make a similar argument. Recommendation letters don't make much of a difference for most students most of the time. It's absurd that hundreds of universities went test optional during the pandemic to supposedly increase access, yet none of them, to my knowledge, removed their recommendation letter requirements. Rec letters advantage the most privileged students in schools that have low counselor and teacher to student ratios. My favorite finding from researching my book, Surviving the College Admissions Madness, comes from a January 7, 1979 New York Times article with a refreshingly honest headline. An admissions man says it isn't so hard. The admissions man in question on this article is Richard M. Mole, a former Harvard and Yale admissions reviewer who was then the director of admissions at Vassar. An accompanying cartoon graphic features a nervous Yale admissions administrator cutting a house in two with a knife and fork as the family looks on. Mole's polemic on the application process reads the same then as today. He complains about non-standardized grading systems, lifeless essays, unhelpful interviews, and universities that possess all of the power at the expense of families. He cites the 1974 Buckley Amendment, more commonly known today as FERPA, that struck down institutional confidentiality. FERPA allowed students to view their reference letters, among other materials. But in the years following the Buckley Amendment, Mole observes that teachers and principals are less inclined to write honestly about a candidate's character or ability. He writes, "Principals, counselors, and teachers fear that they might be sued if they boldly and honestly write on a college admissions form, 'Martha's record is rather good, but Martha is rather dull.'" Today's Common Application strongly urges that applicants waive their FERPA rights so that they cannot see their recommendation letters. Reference letters remain mostly confidential, yet all recommendations are subject to the courtesy bias. Counselors and teachers are highly unlikely to write anything less than complimentary platitudes and superlatives. Referees may even feel flattered when someone asks them for a reference and feel subtle pressure to highlight positive characteristics. Reference letter hyperbole is the norm, muddying up the terrain for genuinely exceptional candidates to distinguish themselves from every other best of applicant. Mole contrasts the contemporary watered-down recommendation letter with its origins. Reference letters originally formed the old boys system, where a well-placed reference from people in power could pass an applicant through ID gatekeepers without further consideration. Teacher and counselor recommendation letters remain a fixture at elite universities. Their precise role in holistic review remains unclear, and it's subject to the whims of each institution and even each reviewer. Some universities provide a separate score in their internal file review process, but recommendation letters suffer from vagueness, just like most college essays, as I've discussed in previous videos. It's questionable how much utility a distinct recommendation letter score would even provide reviewers. Ambiguities abound about which universities require, recommend, or allow letter submissions as an option. According to the Federal Common Data Sets, at least 1,000 universities consider reference letters as part of their admissions process. Like the proliferation of essay requirements at less selective universities that I've discussed in previous videos, campuses that could admit most of their applicants based on academics alone still require recommendation letters. Some universities explicitly require the letter to come from a core subject teacher, whereas others don't. Many universities that require counselor letters, which provide context to a student's course rigor or discrepancies between grades and test scores, request their submission on templates specific to that university. And with more students applying to an increasing number of universities, counselors have to recreate the wheel many times for the same student. When I worked for UT Austin, there was no limit on the number of letters a student could submit. The record I observed was 8 recommendation letters submitted by a single student. Mole writes, "Now we say, the thicker the folder, the thicker the kid," suggesting that a stack of unsolicited recommendation letters usually means an attempt to disguise a weak candidacy. Recommendation letters are the most try-hard aspect of college admissions because students incorrectly assume that the quantity of letters matters more than their quality. It's always preferable to submit a single strong letter where you've collaborated with your reference than 4 half-baked ones. Except for interviews, letters are arguably the most time-consuming application item relative to the difference that they make. For high schools with upwards of 900 students per counselor, and with many US News Top 100 private schools requiring counselor letters, references require tens of millions of work hours worldwide from already burdened high school staff. 15% of universities report that references are of considerable importance in the review process, but they're still less than the importance of essays, although substantially more important than extracurriculars and interviews. Among the thousands of applications I reviewed for UT Austin, I can honestly recall less than 10 times that an outstanding letter bumped up a student's review score. Just like with college essays, most teacher reference letters aren't especially well written or insightful. They're vague, not specific to the student, and almost always a repetition of what's already on the transcript or resume. Students don't provide adequate documentation about the specific examples or events that they desire their letter writer to discuss. Brag sheets often amount to a regurgitation of what will already have been mentioned elsewhere in the application, so reference letters often add little if any depth. They miss opportunities to discuss exceptional circumstances in favor of cliches and platitudes. Consequently, references often make claims like, "Jared is the most promising student in my 20 years of teaching," without providing any evidence or examples to corroborate what makes Jared supposedly unique. When every letter claims a student is seemingly outstanding, that means nobody is. Rare are the teachers with reputations for writing excellent letters with a clear framework for students to request them. These rare teachers have rigorous standards, they decline more requests than they accept, and they submit comparatively few letters. Other teachers are reference mills who churn out dozens each year. Most of them write superficial letters that could apply to most of their students most of the time. High school teacher Andrew Simmons shares an educator's perspective in an Atlantic essay, "The Art of the College Recommendation Letter." Reference letters tending toward courtesy use loaded terms that, quote, "reduces students to bland shades of their real vibrant selves," or they're often blatantly misleading. Quote, "A respectful, quiet student might sit in the back of class and never contribute to discussions. A gregarious social student may be a real pain in the ass unless his talkativeness is harnessed for an academic purpose. A late bloomer probably tanked his freshman year." As with college essays, it's challenging to decipher what exactly the writer intends to communicate. Simmons observes that he and his colleagues, despite their best intentions, contribute to a, quote, "admissions officer seeing hundreds of letters that encounter the same cliched phrases and trite euphemisms again and again." Teachers are busy enough sponsoring extracurriculars, attending staff development meetings, and other non-classroom commitments where they're not compensated. So recommendation letters just add another item and responsibility on their already overburdened workload. Admissions veteran John Beckenstedt, formerly the director of admissions at DePaul University, calls into question the utility and fairness of recommendation letters in a March 4, 2016 Washington Post article. He observes that the recommendation letter system has changed very little in the past century. He questions their supposed utility to eliminate nuances of character, intellect, curiosity, and special talent that help an applicant rise above the masses of otherwise similar students. As with this video, he urges looking at recommendation letters from the students rather than the institution's perspective. Teenagers navigate the reference letter process blindly. Attaining references privileges students who can sort out which teachers are the strongest writers and those who are willing to dedicate time to submit their best effort. Beckenstead writes, "The letter has virtually nothing to do with the student's performance and a lot to do with the teacher's ability to turn a phrase, note interesting character traits, structure a cogent series of paragraphs that tell a story, or in short, it's as much about the teacher as it is the student." He makes the obvious point that students attending small college prep schools will receive more thoughtful letters from staff who know them better than their public school peers. Universities that require counselor letters confer an added advantage to prep school or high-resource public school students who often have a dedicated counselor or a small army of staff members exclusively responsible for helping their students navigate university gatekeepers. Counselors at most public schools cannot cater to their highest-tier college-going students because instead they focus on resolving family crises, discipline issues, and accommodating special needs students, identifying signs of abuse, and more routine drudgery such as schedule changes. Gaps in expectations about what kinds of students should receive bachelor's degrees also influence a recommender's potential bias. An innovative longitudinal study evaluated 2 teachers' perceptions of more than 6,000 high school sophomores. White teachers were more enthusiastic about the prospects of white students compared with their black classmates. The researchers wrote, "When teachers of different races evaluated the same black student, white teachers were 9 percentage points less likely than their black colleagues to expect that student to earn a college degree. This gap was more pronounced for black male students than for black female students." End quote. Because black teachers are underrepresented in American schools, aspiring black college students have fewer opportunities to solicit reference letters from teachers who may be supportive of their future goals. Even though recommendation letters favor the privileged and they're potentially prone to bias, and they require a disproportionate amount of time relative to the difference they make for any given applicant, unfortunately, they're likely here to stay. Students attending resource-rich schools experience burdens and pressure to secure the best references. But in contrast, students living in poverty are unlikely to understand their importance or have the wherewithal to secure high-quality letters in the first place. First-generation college students or children living in non-professional families may not have had family members or friends to consult about navigating the reference process. Because many top universities require reference letters for admissions eligibility, reference letters erect barriers to college access. Recommendation letter requirements expose the hypocrisy of universities who claim to value diversity and inclusion, but their practices suggest otherwise. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe. You can find my email in the information section of this video, so feel free to reach out if you're interested in working together.